I wanted to start off today. Flood insurance has been a topic that's been kind of overpowering, our real estate market and economy lately. And wanted to start off talking about that a little bit because there have been a lot of news releases over the past few weeks of ways that remedy is coming for some of the challenges with flood insurance. The first one is two private insurers, and we talked a little bit about this last week, but now there are two private insurers that are going to offer flood insurance in Florida. That, from what I hear, Mike, it sounds like the lenders have to accept those private policies in lieu of the FEMA policy.
Well, that would be true. One of the issues that has to do with private insurance is that they have to figure out how they can actually start offering the policies in Florida, because there's nothing like it that exists at this time. So once they figure out how to implement their business in Florida, it'll become available. The other challenge that they have is that there isn't currently any way for them to determine or assess their risk. So in order for them to actually start a company, they have to be able to determine their risk analysis to determine how to rate the policies.
And that's the whole thing with the NFIP to begin with, too, is that's part of the legislation that's being proposed, is that they have to do a study to more or less kind of iron out and understand risks in local areas.
Yeah, that's a good segue into what's going on with the current flood legislation. FEMA was supposed to have done an analysis within 18 months of enacting the Biggert Waters Act.
Which they didn't.
Hasn't been done yet. So now part of the delay in the legislation is to determine how long is it going to take to do that. And right now I believe they're talking about a delay of 4 years before implementing these things. And when they make that decision, they're going to have to go retroactive, because there's already policyholders paying the additional rates.
Right, which is really kind of frustrating, because the Biggert Waters Act had a lot of other contingencies in it that said these things are going to happen before it goes into place. And those things didn't happen, but it went live October 1 anyway. It's kind of discouraging. I think the government shutdown had something to do with that, because they were working on the fiscal policy stuff and maybe not paying attention a little bit. But nonetheless, there is a plan, a House Senate plan in place to delay these increases. The provisions of the bill, if it becomes law in its current form, so this is not law as of now. It still has to be. It's a bipartisan bill that's got support from both sides. Sounds like it's got a lot of strong support, but it has to be voted on in the House and Senate, and then President Obama must sign it. So the other provisions of the bill, a 4-year delay of the Biggert Waters Act, kind of the changes that went into place October 1. There's an affordability study that has to be done within 18 months so that they can assess risk. It creates a new flood insurance rate map advocate within FEMA. FEMA must prove that its analysis it conducts on an area's flood insurance risk uses a modern risk-based approach. FEMA may reimburse policyholders who successfully appeal a flood map designation with National Flood Insurance Funds. So it sounds good. I saw, at first I was excited, thinking, man, this thing might happen pretty quick, because, and like I talked with Richard on the show before about, there are a lot of people that really aren't getting touched by this, or getting touched very, very small numbers that aren't really impacting. There's a small percentage that are being impacted. However, the small percentage that are being impacted enough that it's spooking people. It is harming the real estate market, not necessarily because each person is looking at what the flood will cost them, but more the fear over the overall response of the market and home values if this happens. Could it send values in coastal areas declining because it makes it so unaffordable? So it's not just, we've got clients whose homes are elevated, or whose homes are have really low flood insurance, and they're like, well, hey, what's the big deal? My flood insurance is pennies. And that's not really the issue right now. The issue is that it's spooking consumers, not just locally, but internationally and outside the country that are hearing about all this stuff. It's spooking them from even looking at coastal real estate. They're fearful of it. And but when the first last week, when the first news kind of came out about this House Senate plan, I got excited, thinking, oh, this is going to happen kind of quick. And now news releases are starting to say, oh, it might not get touched till January, which will be really discouraging. A couple months of this kind of lingering over people and having that kind of fear out there,
Yeah, there's the legislation, the legislators don't get together, I believe it's February or March when they have the next session. And everybody that is supporting this new legislation is pushing to have it discussed at that time. So there is going to be a little bit of a delay. But on a positive note, the other thing, you and I were speaking before the show about this, for consumers who don't know what the effect's going to be, or if they're concerned, all they need to do is make a phone call to an agent and find out what is the situation with their property.
Right, because that's the thing. A lot of people are making assumptions, and they're assumptions that are wrong based on bad information or based on something, you know, God forbid, their realtor told them, you know, and again, we're not flood insurance agents, you know, that we just like you said, there are times when people look their property up on, you know, on tax rolls and find out that it says it's a flood zone, but when you do an elevation cert, it's not in a, you know, it's not, or the maps are wrong, or, I mean, there's all kinds of things that you could be given misinformation about, so you really do need to talk to somebody that's experienced in flood insurance to know for sure how it's going to impact you.
Yeah, and even better than that is, in some cases, a flood elevation certificate is not even required. You don't even need to spend that money. You just need to speak to an agent, because when we go to the flood insurance department to rate a property, if it is showing as an active flood zone in the tax records, but it's not in the flood department, there's a reason, and there could be what's called a LOMA, which is a letter of map adjustment, which after 1985, when all of the flood maps were redone, there were a number of exceptions to those flood maps that were done, and they're recorded, but not everyone's aware of them. Well, we have the ability to determine if that is the case. And in the last month, I have found 2 properties where people were very concerned about their flood insurance and what it would cost them, and it was determined very simply that they were not in an active flood zone.
Yeah, and that's the key. I mean, get the right advice, get the right information. But in the meantime, obviously, you know, call your senator or congressman. I would love to see this happen, you know, pushed sooner rather than later. Like we said, a couple months in our slow season, I mean, this kind of lingering over people and not getting addressed sooner, when they really botched it to begin with. This should have been addressed before October 1. You know, giving it 3 months and the impact that could have on Florida's real estate market could be immeasurable. I mean, there will be sales that won't happen. There will be international people that won't buy homes here. You know, we've already had sales fall apart over this. And again, not because of the flood cost on that particular property, more because the consumer's overreaching concern that if this isn't fixed, it will have a larger impact on our real estate market that makes them fearful to buy until this gets addressed. So it really does need to get addressed. Call your senator, call your congressman, tell them to touch on this. Rectify this sooner rather than later. Don't let this sit for 3 months. And that's something I hope happens, and we'll see kind of as you know, the lobbyists and everybody push to see if it gets addressed any sooner.